Góðan daginn og komið sæl og velkomin á enn fyrirlesturinn í Röðu félagsfræðinga og námsbrautar í fornleifafræði við Háskóla Íslands og Þjóðminjasafnsins. Samkvæmt dagskránni ætlaði Albína Hulda Pálsdóttir að segja okkur rannsóknum sínum á hundum í dag, en sá fyrirlestur frestast fram til 19. apríl fram við páska. En við vorum svo heppin að hér í landinu íkomin Anna Severin Beck, sem doktorsnemi við Háskólann í Árósum og að rannsaka hús á Járnblönd, og hún var svo góð að hlaupa í skarðið og segja okkur frá rannsóknum sínum. Anna, take it away.
Yeah, thank you for coming, even though I'm here on a kind of a cancellation. Yeah, I'm a visiting PhD student. I guess that's what you said. Didn't get all of it, at least. But well, my purpose here is to try to give you kind of a brief overview of my PhD project. And I'll try to do it in 40 minutes, but there might be some details that I miss out, and so I hope we can discuss it afterwards. And you can just ask questions. First, I think I want to kind of say a bit about the context of the project. It's a co-funded PhD project, as my background is in the museum world, so at a local Danish museum, Museum Sydøstdanmark, which is kind of southern part of Zealand. But then it's a cooperation between the museum and Aarhus University. But the project is also linked up to a project at the National Museum in Copenhagen, and also got some funding from the Agency of Culture in Denmark. So everybody's mentioned, and yeah, everybody's happy. So just to kind of set the scene, I'm working with longhouses in the late Iron Age in southern Scandinavia, and well, just a quick overview of southern Scandinavia. It kind of includes modern Denmark and Scania, Halland and Blekinge, as like one region. And when I talk about late Iron Age, I both include what we in Denmark call Germanic Iron Age and Viking Age as one lump, because that makes meaning that's meaningful in kind of a settlement context, at least. Yeah, and longhouses. That's that. So my aim of the project is to investigate the longhouse as an archaeological phenomenon, which means both working with how we as archaeologists perceive the longhouse, as well as kind of trying to find new ways to achieve knowledge out of this material. So it's based in settlement archaeology in southern Scandinavia. It's kind of I think I owe just a short kind of introduction to the settlement archaeology of southern Scandinavia. It's kind of a dominant way to work with archaeology, as it's the major part of excavations is prehistoric settlements, and I also owe to say that excavations in Denmark is very centralized. Centrally organized, so we have the Agency of Culture, which is kind of administering all the excavation activity, and then it's the local museums that kind of act it out in the local areas, which means that we also have a very centralized way of recording, so it makes sense to kind of talk about this as like a general approach to archaeology in southern Scandinavia. And coming to techniques, a lot of these sites are excavated as open area excavations, so meaning opening up large areas with JCB, removing the topsoil, and we all very often working in open fields, in cultivated fields, which means areas that have been plowed for more or less the last 1,000 years. Which also has a consequence on the material that we're working with. So the conditions of the archaeological material is kind of fragmented, you could say, because, well, practically, or very, very rarely, there's anything left of the actual structure. We're only working with subsoil features, So nothing of the actual structure that we're trying to interpret on. Normally there's no floor layers, no internal structures. Yeah, so that's kind of the conditions. So when we're excavating, normally each feature is excavated. So if we follow here, I try to look at like if you take one archaeological feature and then see how it's processed through the recording. Well, of course, sorry, forgot to say, but in the field, it's excavated, it's documented, it's described, sometimes also sampled, depending on which questions you point at the structure. But in post-ex, we have these two central databases of recording archaeological data, which is kind of it's forming the way that the data is presented to the future archaeologists when they want to work with it. So here highlighted is just an example of a post hole. So we have you call the date of the excavation, the ID number, then kind of the main type of the feature, in this case post hole, and then as a subtype, which is in this case a roof supporting post, so internal post inside the house. And then there's two columns for recording the dating of the feature. And these it's obligatory to put in a start date, and then you can also put an end date. And these dating, they're preset and linked to kind of the conventional archaeological periods. And these might seem like a bit too much details, but I hope it makes sense later on to point this out. And then there's this big box where you could put whatever descriptions you got of the feature. So, I mean, in practice, you're kind of free to put whatever you want into it, but it's normally kind of a basic descriptions of depth and the profile, the filling of the post hole, and maybe an interpretation of the function of it. And then a step further, the site is recorded in this central database called Fund- og Fortidsminder, which is administered by the Agency of Culture. And this is actually their administrative tool to manage all the excavations. So every excavation should practically at least be in this database. So when the report has been written, it's uploaded to the system and it's put in with whatever kinds of types of structures. And again, there's a date linked to each type of structure. And these dates are again, you choose from the preset periods of the conventional periods, which is then applied to the data. So, as I think what I'm trying to point out here is that the dating is kind of a central issue of recording the material. So questions about the date of the house, which is very often based on typological considerations, but also C14 datings, findings, of course, any artifacts from the house. But also phases in the settlement, and then kind of on a general level, we're constantly working on this, on the typological development and refining the typology, so we can, date the houses more precisely. But that's kind of the central issues and the central questions asked to the material. And that kind of frustrates me, but I see this as a consequence of this kind of I call it a negative perception of the material, but maybe disappointment would be maybe a better kind of way to phrase it. Because I think every archaeologist, they kind of hope to find this house, but what they actually find is kind of this these post holes and these subsoil features. So every time you kind of expect something else than what you're finding, and when when the findings are like, or the archaeological material are like this, the conditions of it, it's really hard to answer kind of basic questions of which activities took place in the house and where did they take place in the house. And that kind of results in this negative perception of the material. So there's very few kind of attempts to push the material further on and get more knowledge out of it. And that's kind of what motivates me for doing this project. Because I think, of course, I'm full of understanding of the kind of disappointment with the material that it's as it is, but I mean, it's a condition that we can't really do anything about. And maybe going into the material in more kind of positive way and actually looking at what is the material and what does it really tell us would maybe kind of change this negative perception to a more positive way of looking at the material. So what I try to do is kind of really zoom in and look at what the single or the individual elements of the longhouse. And again, here I'm zooming in on one particular post hole. And what is the post hole? It's in kind of general terms, you could say it's fossilized actions. So it's a matter of somebody digging a hole at some point in time, and then putting a post in it and filling in the post hole, and then later on maybe doing some repairments, and then when the house is demolished, maybe even digging up the post for reuse at some other place. So in all these layers, there are kind of fossilized actions. And I know this is not a new perception of the post hole, but it's a way of perceiving the archaeological material that are not really encouraged by the way that it is recorded in the databases. Furthermore, I mean, there is problems with the typologies. I mean, it looks really, really neat. I mean, typology is about kind of narrowing down which kind of architecture was dominant in which period. But the problem is that we have features from houses from the 10th century also present in the 12th century, and things or features present in the 9th century also contemporary with the 10th century, and further on. So we have houses with straight walls, but still kind of the supporting construction of houses that are much earlier. So in reality, the picture is much more messy than this kind of very linear and neat picture. But I think this linear way of perceiving the materials is very much encouraged again by the way that we record the material, and kind of this focus on linking the conventional periods to the houses instead of kind of working with datings in more dynamic ways. So the way I see it, we're actually pushing kind of a house which is kind of multi-temporal. It has a duration, it has a start and end, it does all kinds of things, and we try to fit it in with this kind of linear chronology of the house, which is kind of at least thought-provoking and motivating to find other ways to work with the material. And one way to maybe have a relook and reinterpretation of the house would be to look at the biography of the house. So in the same way that we talk about biographies of people, we can talk about biographies of houses, that they can have a birth and a life and a death. So the birth would obviously be when the house is built. And there's all kinds of processes linked to this building process, the construction and finding the building materials, for instance. Then the life of the house, the habitation of the house is also linked to kind of the access patterns and movement in the house, the outlay. And then the decay and the death of the house is both linked to repairs and the maintenance of the house, kind of postponing the death of the house, and then finally, when it can't be postponed anymore, the demolition of the house in the end. and this kind of gives a completely different way to look at the houses, not just in putting one date to the house, but actually trying to give it a duration. And at least in round numbers, we're talking about a lifetime of the longhouse having living like 50 to 75 years, and some are even talking about houses being 100 years old. But because of the posts that are supporting the whole construction, they're dug into the ground, they rot naturally, and therefore, I mean, there is kind of a limited lifetime of these houses. But on the other hand, we're having a lifetime here that is kind of going beyond like the average life age of people in the late Iron Age. So here we're working with houses that have a different kind of biography than the household and the people living in the house. So it's longer. So you can have people being born in an old house and maybe even die in the same house, and the house continue to live on, which is very different from previous periods where houses only maybe lasted for 30 years and have a more kind of dynamic link to the household and the life of the household. And I use this kind of biographical approach to the houses as a way to try to understand the longhouse in a settlement context. So I'm working with one particular site, which is called Strøby Toftegård. It's on the eastern part of Zealand. And instead of looking at typological differences in houses and how they're constructed, I try to look at the number of repairments and the kind of the dimensions of the timber. So kind of trying to at least count on kind of a general lifetime of these houses. And then it turned out there was certain patterns that deferred the main houses, which could be interpreted as the dwelling houses, and then which has a long lifetime and maintained, but also built of really solid timber. So it's supposed to be, I mean, they're having a long life and I mean being repaired and taken care of, opposed to kind of the outbuildings that are more kind of slender timber and not repaired in the same degree as these main houses. So it's a different way to kind of go into understanding the house in a settlement dynamic. Sorry, I forgot to say there's I can also kind of identify the central farming unit that definitely is different from the other settlement units in the settlement, because especially the demolition of the houses are different in this unit, and I'll get back to that later on. Because then I also try to work with the social memory of the longhouse, and just very briefly, social memory in kind of general terms is the shared notions of history, norms, and traditions in a community. And we talk about both, this can be shared both in inscribed ways, so in very formalized telling stories, writing history down, and as well as incorporated practices, so it's more kind of embodied and transferred through the physical environment that you're in. And this is where I see the longhouse and the role of the longhouse in kind of creating this social memory and sharing of social memory. So returning to Strøby Toftegård, I try to look at three kind of practices in how the longhouse kind of interact with this social memory. And first, it's the history of the landscape. So how the settlement are actually interacting with the ancient monuments in the area. And very close to this settlement, there's a Neolithic mound. So, I mean, it's several thousand years older than the settlement, and the chances of those people living in the settlement knowing the people being buried in the mound is, close to zero, I would say. But it's not the same as this mound would not have kind of having stories linked to it. but maybe not to the exact people buried in this mound. And we actually have settlement features also all the way around the mound. So we can see in that way that the mound has been incorporated into the settlement actively. But furthermore, I hope you remember this is where the central unit of the settlement is located. There's also a little group or a small group of late Bronze Age urns right under where kind of the first longhouses was built in this settlement. And that might be coincident, but it might not be in the way that they're definitely kind of respecting these urns. And looking at a broader material, there's definitely a pattern of settlements relating to ancient monuments. Here we are at the big, the elite settlement at the Lejre, the first kind of phase of that, built in Fredshøj, where the big main dwelling house is built like less than 10 meters from a Bronze Age mound. And I mean, topography-wise, the longhouse could be placed many other places, but for some reasons it really had to be placed right there, very, very close to this Bronze Age mound. And in the same way, the elite settlement at Tisø, Fugledegård, is also located right on top of a group of early Roman Iron Age graves. And again, I mean, it's a discussion whether these graves have been marked or not. I mean, if they've been recognizable on the surface. But at least, I mean, these are just a few examples, but there's many examples of kind of older graves that have been incorporated into settlements. So interpreting this, I think it's a way to kind of create continuity with the ancient mythical past. So graves that they don't know the people that are buried there, but it's part of their history, and they kind of incorporate it and create this kind of continuity with the history of the landscape. But then turning to the settlement and the rebuilding of longhouses, because as I said, these houses has certain limited lifetime, but they're actually rebuilding the same longhouse. I mean, an exact copy of the longhouse is built in exactly or more or less the exact same spot. And this is also a way to kind of cope with the previous house and kind of the rebuilding and continuing the house. So it's in practice it's the same house that they're building in the same place. So if you, I don't know, closed your eyes, you wouldn't probably not recognize or see that it's a different house. And this practice can also be seen in different places. And here again we are in Lejre in a later phase where we have 3 or 4 phases of the same longhouse built on top of each other, as well as a small enclosure. And again at Tisø we have 3 phases of the smallest house, which is built in exactly the same place and actually reusing the same post holes for the same construction. And then in a later phase they built, I mean, a completely different structure, but still in kind of overlapping, and that must be, I think, that's deliberate. It's not coincident that it's overlapping. So again, it's about creating continuity, not with the ancient past, but this is with their own history, kind of the near genealogical past, and kind of handling their own history in the way that they built and rebuilt the houses in the settlement. And then the final practice that I've been looking at is the way to create monuments within the settlement. Here again we are at Strøby Toftegård, and we have this quite unique house, which at the excavation it turned out that both the wall ditch and all the post holes were filled up with water rolled stones, and not just filled up, but really packed with these water rolled stones. And talking to the farmer, he said that, well, his grandfather and his father had been removing stones from this area, I mean, forever. So it's not just a few stones, we're talking about masses of stones in this area. And when looking at the features, it actually looks like the stones hasn't been. Well, they might have been part of the construction, but they definitely has also been added afterwards, after the house was demolished. So maybe this is about actually burying the house under a big pile of stone and kind of creating a monument within the settlement of the house. So the house, in that way, kind of continued to live within the settlement. And this resembles these stone piles that are also found in settlements in late Iron Age settlements, where many of these stone piles are made of burnt stone, though not water rolls, but at least in the house in Strøby-Toftegård, there was also burnt stones in certain places. So here again we are at Lejre, where this big pile, it's a black dotted thing. There's a big pile of burnt stone, and well, in the end it was more than 37 meters in diameters and 1.5 meters in height. So that's quite a lot of stones, and it seems like it's been built up during the whole settlement as a kind of continuous way of adding stones. And the question is, what does this mean, and what does these stones? What were the purpose of these stones? And I mean, the same phenomenon can be observed in other places, both at Tisø that I presented before, and this is Jærestad in Scania. There's also like a big pile of a very large pile of burnt stones, and these are monuments that are maybe different from kind of the burial monuments, but it's monuments that are they're at least very physical, and they're present in the settlement, and they're kind of the people in the settlement are interacting with these piles of stones continuously. So I interpret it as a way to kind of creating continuity into the future and kind of securing your own legacy and securing that your future generations also kind of remember you. So we could talk about a future past in that way. So hopefully, well, that's what I try to kind of argue here, is that the houses or the longhouses are kind of caught in between things that are oriented towards the past and things that are oriented towards the present and things that are oriented towards the future. So in that way, it's multi-temporal, and it is kind of a core as a core phenomenon. And then returning to the way that we record houses in the databases, I think we have a problem with the whole notion about house types, as it's kind of reductive, and it doesn't really catch all these kind of temporal relationships very very well. So if we're only looking at houses in typological ways, we're actually losing out quite a lot. That's at least what I would argue. I'm not saying that we shouldn't use typology, because we kind of use it automatically, but as a dating tool. But we can't really use these house types as an explanation and an understanding of the house. It doesn't really give us that. Because the way I see it, the house is not a closed unit. It's not like a set thing that is built and then it's there. It's actually kind of a dynamic assemblage of things happening both during the building, the inhabitation, the decaying, and the death of the house. So a reason for this kind of the notion of the house type, I would suggest that it kind of has its origins in the mass-produced houses that was built during the 20th century. At least in Denmark, there was a big building boom in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, where people or families moving out from the towns, moving out in the suburbs, and they could choose from a catalog whether they want type A or type B, and then they could order it and build it almost themselves, these houses. And I'm just wondering if it's this kind of thinking about houses that has been transferred to to the way that we think about house types and typologies. At least it's contemporary with the development of the whole house typologies in southern Scandinavia. So there might be a link there and an explanation. But we need new ways to kind of work with these houses that can also handle the variation of the houses and the temporalities as well as the similarities. It's not to deny that there are similarities and between the houses, but we just need a more dynamic way to look at it. So that's why I've turned to kind of thinking about the houses as assemblages. So as the result of kind of an interaction between the building materials, the constructions, the traditions, the atmosphere of the house, the way it's used, the people living in it, the activities, the people looking at the house from the outside. All these things bundled together in unique historical situations that are creating unique houses that are similar in some ways and unique in other ways. And I think this way of thinking about the house as an assemblage is very fruitful in the way of understanding the house as something that's constantly developing and constantly changing according to the people being in the house and the context it's based in. I mean, I try to illustrate with this 100-Wasser house because I think it actually catches it very nicely with where also the trees are tenants of the house and kind of this way of thinking about the house as a living unit. So getting to kind of the end of my presentation is this is also about thinking about the houses as homes. And especially the processes of building a home. And I see this again as a multi-temporal process that people, when they're building a home and when they're dwelling in their home, they're again talking about or oriented also towards things in the past, which is kind of traditions, norms, ways that we know you have to behave, but also the needs in the present actual situation that kind of defines what we really need now is this or this. And then it's also, building a home is also linked to the dreams and hopes for, I mean, popularly said, a good life. So what we really hope to get from this house and I think if we're thinking about houses in this, the tension between past, present, and future, I think we would get very far. So, yeah, just studying these processes, but it also includes thinking about archaeology not just as a retrospective science, but kind of defining house types by looking retrospectively at the material, but also thinking about the material in prospective ways. So kind of thinking about how people, when they were building the house, they didn't feel that they were from the way from type A to type B. They probably felt that they were on top of the evolution. So in that way, we should kind of include these perspectives as well in our thinking about the houses. So yeah, ending with this, building is an activity. It's what builders do. I think that kind of catches it all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I guess we'll take questions.
Yeah. If.
I have a question, sort of an easy one, but we all know that posts are buried in the soil, and yet the soil is protected by the roof and it's within the house, and we all know they deteriorate. What is the process actually that a protected piece of wood in the house, which is underground, deteriorates? Why is it?
The way I understand your question, I mean, the rotting process is not in the ground, but in where ground and earth are kind of meeting.
Is it because of the moisture within the house on the surface of the floor?
And the oxygen. in the air and not in the ground. So I mean, we have houses where you have like the last bits of posts still left in or still preserved in the post hole, like where the rest has been rotting away and you could remove it, but then there's a last stump left in the post hole.
Is it moisture, bacteria within the house on the floor that is eating the wood, or is it just plain moisture?
That's a good question. I mean, it's there's definitely somebody knowing that. Yeah, I mean, it's very, I mean, technical, probably. I mean, bacteria, yeah, definitely being part of it, moist and oxygen. But I mean, we can see that from reconstructed houses. I mean, we can see this process in real life, or whatever you would call it. And you can see that the structure can actually stand quite a while, even though it's not really any longer. It's kind of how do you say, like grounded in the ground. So it might have been rotted away, but it's actually still standing because there's some stability in the construction itself.
So the inhabitants of the house can actually judge and take a look and say, oh my goodness, the house is about to collapse.
Yeah. And we have lots of examples of I mean, these big posts being replaced. And we know that I mean, further on in time, in medieval period, there's actually, they put in laws of people are not allowed to build houses with the posts in the ground because they're rotting away. And I mean, because of lack of timber. So they actually, I mean, put in the laws that you have to put your timber on a rock so it doesn't rot. So it's definitely something happening right where I mean, where the ground and the air is meeting.
Sure. One other quick question on that. At Mosel, we found that the timbers in the ground were burned. Is there a process like that you see in Denmark?
Oh, that's a hard question because we don't really know what to look for. I mean, you mean like...
the part that went into the ground was shaped into a point and it was fire hardened, and we still had the wood.
Well, we don't know if they were kind of pointed, but they might have been like sweating just kind of on the surface to postpone the rotting process. But I mean, it will rot eventually in the end. So.
Can I ask you? You said that these buildings, they last for 50 to 75 years. Mm-hmm. How can you measure that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky one because of course it depends on the subsoil. So we have sandy areas where it would definitely not last for 75 years, but shorter. And in the area that I'm working with, it's the subsoil is like really hard clay, so that would kind of give it more years. But I mean, it's argument that is linked up to the experiences from reconstructed houses and from old laws and stuff. But I mean, in Denmark at least we have reconstructed houses that are built in 64, 65, still standing. So that kind of gives the picture.
There's nothing in the archaeology itself, the remains, that allows you to assess the length of.
No.
I mean, I imagine that you can, at a site like Vorbasse or where you have a long history, you can just, if you've made up your mind about how many phases there are, and then you can just divide it by the total.
Yeah.
But you have some dating indications. But because I mean, I guess that's central to what you're interested in is what happens during the time that the house is being used, and so I would think that it's critical to be able to, how do you get around the problem that you only have post holes left?
Yeah. Yeah, that's the whole core issue, kind of. And of course, I mean, yeah, it would be like in the case of Strømtoft, we kind of have like a starting date and end date, and then we can kind of again, I mean, count how many faces and do some calculations, but it would still be kind of round numbers, but at least a guideline. But we can't kind of put secure numbers until we find, like, I don't know, the building year bird somewhere. Or maybe, I mean, in the area that I'm working with, there's another guy who's working with the C14 datings. And I mean, if you have a dense settlement where you can take a lot of C14 datings of the same structure, maybe you can get, like, in statistical calculation at least, you can get kind of a more, I don't know, a better view of the duration of the house, at least. So not trying to single down the dating of the house to one date and put that in your database, but actually kind of give the image of the duration of the house. So that's also a way to kind of go forward. But I mean, the material that I'm working with is quite old, so that I don't have many C14 datings. So. But unfortunately,
not work here.
Yeah, we don't have any floor layers. Okay. They're completely plowed out. So what we do is, like, the JCB is removing the topsoil, which is kind of everything above. Yeah. So there's no floor layers. I mean, I read an article where they were actually looking at microfines, so cordon in the post holes, and I mean, that might be one way to kind of go further, but we still have the problem of where does these fines, do they actually link directly to the activity in the house?
Do you have a sense of how deeply below the original floor layer it's been plowed out? Like, is it a few centimeters, or is it?
That's hard, because I mean, I only show you pictures of really well preserved houses, but we have houses where it's only kind of the post hole from the roof supporting posts. So, I mean, where you don't even have the walls. So
isn't there a single floor layer from that anywhere?
I know it sounds really shocking to Icelandic archaeologists, but well, there is a few places, I think, in Jutland where they actually built with turf. So maybe that's the way to go. I mean, no, but it's very, very few, and most of these places they've been excavated years and years ago, so we didn't have all these fancy ways to go around it. But I mean, that's the thing that we're always hoping to get, and always kind of disappointed. But.
In part, Ori asked the same question, but I wanted to ask, is there also no stones? In other words, is there no good longhouse? I can see a floor not being there. But in all of Denmark and Scania, there's not a single longhouse that would have the building stones, the posts, and the supports.
Sorry, no.
No,
in southern Scandinavia at least. I mean, because if you're getting kind of beyond Blicking, I think they're actually starting to build with stones, for instance, and that kind of helps it a lot. But I mean, these houses are built of clay, wood, straw. I mean, they were demolished at the time when they couldn't stand anymore, and then 1,000 years of plowing out. So these are also heavy kind of cultivated areas, so very often in an open field, which, yeah, also does something to the material.
Thank you for a very inspiring lecture. You had several things that I'd like to come to, but perhaps just start with your final citation to Tim Ingold, great paper on house building.
Yeah.
And he goes further in that sentence, and he starts that sentence by saying, building is a verb. It's a process.
Yeah.
turn it into a noun and the process comes to a halt.
Yeah.
And I think that's the problem that we archaeologists are dealing with. We are dealing with architecture and houses as something ready-made, which they are not.
Yeah.
And archaeologists like Erickson, of course, they have tried to approach it through concepts like building rhythms. So I would like to perhaps go into your idea of assemblages. What does that contain in your idea? Many have come into that, moved into biographical approaches in order to separate from this idea, which then again is perhaps not that fruitful, because biographical approaches creates a phase of building, a phase of inhabiting, and a phase of decaying, which as well is not correct, because houses start to decay before they're ready built, and people move into houses before they're ready built, and so on. What does your idea of assemblies encompass? What does it? Is it only? Are you only referring to this traditional idea of archaeological assemblies, meaning the material data that you have in hand, or does it involve other things?
Well, at least it involves a discussion exactly of the differences between thinking about house types and then assemblages. So I'm working with there's this iconic house, the Trelleborg house, which is, it was the first Viking Age longhouse that was found and then kind of turned into this iconic thing. But in real life, and this has been kind of defined as a house type and been used as a interpretation of houses all over southern Scandinavia. But the problem is that the defining architectural features in this house are only finding that combination exactly in Trelleborg. And then, so what I'm trying to argue is thinking about it as the house as an assemblage is kind of deconstructing the house into at least the architectural features that I can see in my material, and then recognizing or acknowledging that there are many more, but I can only work from what I've got. But instead of thinking about the people building a house type when they're building a house, they're actually picking out different architectural features and combining them in different ways. So it's trying to work with the whole what happens when you build the house.
Thus, there are many aspects of the assemblage that are not part of the archaeological assembly. We are looking at house building. What do we see? We see posts, there is a structure, but we see a person there, which is a part of that process. Not just part of that process, but is very physically part of the building at that moment. So, I guess you've read Leslie McFadden on these things, how people incorporated this into the building activity, and that's actually the point that Timiko is making as well.
But I completely agree, and I don't want to be another one of those disappointed archaeologists that we don't have any people, we don't have. If we the assemblage thought is really good for asking these questions. And then we can't really maybe answer all of them. But if we don't ask the questions, if we don't talk about the houses as something with people in, then we're kind of not getting very far. And I think we should start talking about houses with people in instead of just talking about houses, even though we don't have the footprint of people.
I would imagine in your case that concepts like building rhythms are extremely interesting incorporating this idea. You talked about different types of building, more ad hoc building, less notion for design or less attended to and things like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, if there are no further questions, we'll thank you very much again. félagstur Joe Walser, hann fellur bara niður og Albína ætlar í staðinn að tala